Welcome to Adapted, the podcast where we explore adaptations of various forms. I'm today's host, Tom, and with me is.
Pat.
And KJ.
Today we'll be discussing the children's book Jumanji from 1981 and at least two of its movie adaptations from 1995 and 2017. So Jumanji is a children's book about these two children who play a game, and it's a jungle game, and out of the game, jungle animals arise, and then they go and put the game back in the park where they found it. The movie, starring Robin Williams, is about two children who start playing the game. One of them, who ages into Robin Williams, gets captured. He comes out of the game almost 3 decades later and has to complete the game along with Bonnie Hunt, everybody's mom from the 90s. And then he does, saves the town, and et cetera, et cetera. The 2017 version, the game has been transformed, seemingly in a kind of Darwinian fashion, into a video game, in which case it sucks into itself a bunch of high schoolers who take on avatars inside this video game and have to save Jumanji, which is now either a town or the region, I'm not entirely sure, from the pernicions of the villain, and then learn about themselves, etc.
So, Tom, when you say the Jumanji game changed Darwinianly,
Like
you mean
evolved.
like
It
it evolved over
evolved. You can say
generations
it
to
was
I guess,
slowly
yeah, I guess you'd say, would you say
optimize?
like Lamarckian? Like, wouldn't Lamarckian be more accurate?
This is I've Lamarck. I've not heard Lamarckian.
Am I saying his name right? Nobody knows what
I
I'm
mean, the
talking
problem is that all of these theories. We're getting very deep here, but these particular theories are all based on death and resources
about. Yes.
of some sort or another, and the use of skills. There's a particular method that they are suggesting for evolution.
Yeah.
Evolution itself was not in question. It was the method of evolution that was in question here. It's certainly not a Darwinian method of evolution. It's just an
No.
evolution.
Yeah, they evolve into.
It's
yeah.
more Pokemon style of evolution. It
There
just sort
we
of
go.
got enough experience points and became the new thing.
Oh. Sorry, I
Yeah,
didn't mean to
that's
derail.
okay.
Go ahead, Tom.
No, that's good.
That was
Yeah, I like
funny.
I like it's not Darwinian, it's Pokemon.
Yeah, Pokemon evolution
Mhm.
style.
Okay, so what did we think of this generally? I think we'll just start general thoughts on these movies, regardless of adaptation or what have you.
So I picked this book and film for some of the topics we'll get into with the adaptation style of it. But I've read the book because I've read it to my kids, and I had seen the newer movie actually. I mean, I knew the premise of the first movie, but I never actually seen it when I was a kid. But I saw the newer movie on an airplane at some point. I don't remember when. Most of the movies that I feel like I'm just like, I saw this at some point on an airplane. I watched a lot of movies on airplanes. But so movies that I wouldn't normally watch. So I watched this on an airplane, and I thought when I saw the 2017 version, I think it's very original. Like I thought it was unique. I thought it was clever. I thought it was funny. I think there's something like I don't think maybe there's other movies that have done that, but I don't think so. I think it's just a really fun, clever, unique sort of like Freaky Friday meets, sort of again like an adventure movie. I thought it was actually meets like Breakfast Club almost. It's and so I thought it was actually quite fun, and I think it's quite a clever way to go about a film and sort of a plot line. So, but the 95 one I hadn't seen, but again, I was familiar with it. So I know what they're doing with it. And having read the book, I was curious what really the movie would do with it because it runs into this adaptation problem, which the Polar Express runs into too, which is the same author, which is they're these short books that they can't they have to turn them into these full-length movies, or they have to turn them into just short movies. And so there's something odd happens when you do that, and I think the 2017 one does something totally different, obviously. So personally, what do I think of them as movies? The second one is much better, I think, if you're gonna get right down to it. I think the first one has a lot of just plot issues and character issues. I just think there's some weirdness going on there, and I'm sure we'll get into it. But I think the second one is, as far as a standalone film, works really well, I think.
Yeah, and just for the audience who may not have seen the first Dwayne Johnson Jumanji, Welcome to the Jungle, one of the plot points or the reason to watch the movie is Dwayne Johnson, Jack Black, and Kevin Hart and Karen Gillan. They are playing kids from the real world. So it's Jack Black playing a TikTok influencer or an Instagram influencer, and
Who's female too?
Right? Yeah, female, and it's a one note joke that lasts for 2 hours wonderfully. The whole movie, like that's the reason we're showing up to this movie. So I just wanted to bring that up for the audience. I grew up with the '96 version. I remember seeing it in theaters. I loved it. I loved it on this rewatch. Maybe it's nostalgia, but it does get a little Home Alone-y. There's some parts that kind of drag, but I really enjoyed it. I think Robin Williams does a great job in it. I think they expand the children's book really well. I had no idea there was a children's book until you brought it up, Pat. So I had read it for the first time for this episode. And again, the children's book is quite tame compared to the '96 movie, which, Pat, you're saying they needed to interpret and add on and expand, and maybe it worked, maybe it didn't. I thought it worked.
I think the expansion works. Essentially what the issue they have is that and again, I think this is a similar problem that the Polar Express movie has. There's really, I mean, essentially there's no characters in the book. Like it's just two kids. They're just all they don't do anything. They have no character. They just roll the dice and say what's coming out of the board. It's the concept that you're there for. You're there for the concept of this, like, oh, this game in which things come out of it, and sort of what could you do with that? I think it's almost the same thing with Polar Express movie. Like there's no there's really no characters, nothing happens. It's just a train that goes to the North Pole. Well, what are you going to do with that? So they blew that up into a full-length movie. I think it's a similar thing with Jumanji, the book. They took a concept, all they had was a concept, and said, okay, we're going to adapt this into a movie by basically coming up with a plot and characters. I think that this is my biggest issue with it, is that, and I know my wife watched it with me last night too, and there is a certain point where it's not that the movie is clever and it's fun, but there is a certain point where they only needed a few little tweaks to really fill it in, but it's just weird because there's a certain point where they just keep dragging it. Like they have to keep coming up. Like at one point they're about to roll the dice and a giant bird flies down, like Finding Nemo style, and picks the board game up and flies off of them. Like, why? Like you could, it was just made no sense. At least, and again, there's another moment where there's like this hunter that's going after the Robin Williams character that's come out of the board, and he's got this giant like blunderbuss gun that he's trying to shoot him with, and he takes the board game in order to trap Robin Williams. Okay, at least that made sense. But they have to keep coming up with ways to extend it that are almost nonsensical, because as much as I don't like this sort of trope where like people always joke about in horror movies where it's like, just get out of the town, don't stay there. I'm like, well, it's a little hard to justify that. Like people wouldn't, yeah, I get it. We know it's a horror movie and this kind of stuff, but they might not react that way. But there's a certain point where in this movie, it's so obvious that all they should do is just roll the dice and pick the dice up and roll the dice and pick the dice up and roll the dice. There's no requirement that they wait for all of these horrible things to happen. If you'd made that a requirement, then I would buy it. If they had made just a simple little thing of you cannot move until the other person's turn,
Until
effect
the
is completed,
threat
okay,
happens.
yeah,
Yep.
then I would have said, okay, now at least there's a logical reason why they're waiting. It would have been easy. They could have done that, and then they didn't need to do all this extra stuff to just keep extending it. That was the biggest problem. It just had like too much extension of thing after thing after thing after thing. And there's a couple other things, but that was my biggest problem. Is just you're just screaming at them, be like, just roll the dice. Why are you waiting? There is no reason for you to watch this thing happen. Like it's raining, roll the dice quickly, go.
We need our quip, but a lot of rain would kill you.
Yeah.
I also want to talk about the plot of the book real quick. So the plot of the book is you got two kids, they're bored. That's their only defining characteristic is they're bored. They find this game and then terrible threats from the game, right? Snakes, monkeys, a lion, like it's right. All of a sudden these threats come out. So is the moral of the book, if you're bored, be careful, you might have horrible threats?
No,
get
I
you?
don't. I think
I
this is
don't.
there's no points. You know,
I don't
these
think
are
it's a
these.
moral.
There's
There's
Yeah.
no
no
moral.
okay.
These are not.
Not a
This is the good.
grim.
This is the good period of books when like the most moralizing you got was the Lorax. You know, it's like
Okay.
Yeah, I made a joke that it's a Puritan moral where just never play games at all. Just work all day, never play games. But I don't think the book has any kind of moral. I think it's just I think it's a fun concept that allows you to do stuff with children's books. I think like children around 8 are probably too old for this, maybe. You Pat would know better than I, but um, it's this idea of like here's a concept and we can repeat it instead of like theme and variation, and that works really well for children of a certain age. But you can't really do that with a movie. You have to make a progression. It has to move to another place. So it doesn't really work.
but that's why the 2017 one does work because there is a definitive reason why they can't leave. That's they can't leave until the game's over. Um, and you know they have to progress through these things, you know, and they give it's not the most brilliant writing in the world, but you know they characters go through some development and they learn about each other and they learn about the problems that each other face. But you know, hey, it still works. There is still a plot. It moves forward. They face obstacles. They overcome them. Like it felt very progressive in a unique setting.
Mhm. Yeah, I would agree. I think the 90 again the 95 one, I think the concept is really great. And like you said, Pat, like this would make a really good horror movie or just a I was like I said this to you guys through text. I think a Tim Burton version of this using, some of the kind of art style of Beetlejuice or something like that would be really fun and really creepy. It's a little sacred. I mean, yes, the plot points aside, and there's also real bizarre tonal shifts, like the store scene where they have these like, you know, like the kid knocks the scuba tanks, the things, the valves off the scuba tanks, so
The
they
Home Alone
the
sequence.
Home Alone scene.
Yeah.
Yeah, it comes at it sort of doesn't feel, and it's also the Robin Williams having to develop as a father doesn't really make sense. Like his
Yeah.
arc of development is he has to be like a dad unlike his dad to this kid, and that doesn't go anywhere because he ends up just becoming a child again at the end. So it's not significant to him becoming a new person or learning about these other people and developing.
And then he has to face his dad shooting him for some reason.
Yeah. Yeah. I guess you could make some sort of, I don't know, like psychoanalysis of the movie, but that seems like too much work.
I don't think it's inviting.
Yeah. I mean, it's the dad is playing the guy who's trying to kill him.
That's the only thing I think
Yeah.
that they're doing, but I think
Yeah.
that's, you know,
Just kind of for fun, then
yeah, I
it's
think that's
nothing.
just for giggles.
I
Mhm.
had no
Yeah.
idea.
Yeah,
Yeah,
it's
it's
the
the
same
same
guy.
actor.
Mhm. He's good in it.
He's good, actually. He's
Yeah,
quite
very good
fun.
Robin.
I actually really, actually, he's probably the best actor. As the dad, he's quite convincing. Like that was a
Mhm.
pretty, again, it's pretty terrifying.
Yeah.
Like the dad is pretty scary. If that was my dad, I would be pretty scared of that man. And as the hunter, I especially love the scene where he walks into the gun shop.
Yeah.
The
Like that,
Terminator scene.
yeah, the Terminator where he just throws down a bunch of like, I want this one, and they're like, I
Mhm.
haven't made that since 1903, and he's like, then I need another one. Like tosses down these gold coins. I mean, that again actually made me laugh in a legitimate way. I went, oh, that was funny, and again, that was clever in much more of a way that the Home Alone scene didn't. Like
Mm.
it was almost somebody. I saw something recently where someone said there's a difference between a children's movie and a family movie, where it's like, kids movie is just for kids. Family movie is like trying to appeal on like multiple levels, like the Shrek kind of movies where they're trying to kind of entertain the adults as well as the children. It almost felt like it was trying to do that, but it couldn't integrate them. Like it couldn't quite figure out how to integrate these sort of terrifying things with just this slapstick almost.
Yeah, that it feels like there's boundaries around the slapstick scenes, especially with the cop, Carl the cop, which I got pretty tired of after a while. Um, he's also a remarkably bad cop. His decisions don't make much
He
sense at all.
says.
Yeah. Um,
The other scene that kind of stood out to me is when Robin Williams first gets back, he goes around his house. That's kind of cool. But then he goes into town, and like a lot of the stores are closed, and there's not quite beggars in this suburb town outside these abandoned stores, but there kind of is. And it felt a little out of place in the movie. And it also made me realize a lot of movies in the 90s where someone from the 60s to 50s come to visit and they're like, oh, the 90s kind of suck. Like the way they show that are these abandoned stores and like bums with hats on. Like, I'm picturing like Back to the Future, it kind of happens.
Yeah.
But this weekend I was at the mall, and it's a mall that is for sale, right? It's not doing well. It's dying. There's not very many stores there. And there's not abandoned stores. There's beautiful billboards showing you what could be there if it wasn't an abandoned store. So I wonder if they're going to make a movie today where someone from the 90s comes and goes to their rundown mall or their rundown area. It's beautiful pictures and billboards of what could be there instead of bums and the paper rolling down the street. And
Yeah, I guess just because a store in the suburbs goes out of business doesn't mean you're going to have a homeless problem 30 minutes later. I don't know why these things are associated with each other.
There is a legitimate sense though of small towns. Definitely, small downtowns did die during that period. So I was just saying, I was like, I think that they're capturing a sense of something was going wrong then. But yeah, to your point, I don't think that meant that immediately there was a homeless problem.
Yeah, I mean, it's also in the movie and also in Back to the Future, in the first one, it's an indication that something has gone wrong that the characters then correct, right? That's the Jumanji game corrects, or by Alan Parrish, by playing it, corrects it, and then the downtown is beautiful. So it's this sort of, it's a wonderful life kind of causal chain. So it raises the stakes, right? Like this town has to be repaired in order to fix this town. We have to play this game and repair it, etc.
It is an interesting question though, because you're right. I was thinking originally, I was like, oh, is this just like a fear that was emerging in the 80s and the 90s? But you're right, that kind of does happen in It's a Wonderful Life too. So there must be, I'm assuming there probably are other movies in which this trope like works its way out. But I wonder if there's any that have happened in the last like 20 years.
No,
Is this a situation that we've rejected?
that
That we don't
that the
care about
causal
that
line.
anymore?
That if you go back in the past and sort of ruin something, then the community is going to fall apart, that type of thing.
Yeah, I wonder if that's
I
like
don't
any
know.
movies have done that in the last 20 years. Like clearly even 30 years ago that was still a concern. But is that
Mhm.
something that's happened in the last 20 years? Has anybody done that?
Not to my memory.
so the greatest gen was in for it. The baby boomers were in for it. But the millennials are like, no, guys, it's actually kind of nice now, too.
But that's what I mean.
Yeah.
Is there like
Mhm.
that's what I'm saying. There's
Yeah.
something weird happened here. I think there's an interesting
Maybe that things have gone online so much that the idea of decay is, I don't like the idea of stores closing up isn't necessarily an indication of something's gone wrong or something like that. I don't really know.
Yeah, I would love to see if there's an example of a movie that's come out in the last 15 or 20 years that has that idea of a character going back into or coming to forward to the future, finding that times have gotten really bad, and then going back in time to have them adjusted.
Hmm.
I wonder what I wonder if there's any movie that's done that. Anyway,
I guess
totally.
the joke would be the guy would come from the 90s to now, and he would like point at the store, like, look, the store's not there, but everybody would just be looking at their phone, so nobody ever noticed. Like that would be the.
Yeah, I guess I don't know. Yeah, that would be that's an interesting trope to explore.
To explore, I would
Yeah.
think.
Yeah, no, I think so.
Totally nothing to do with this particular
Yeah,
one.
no,
Because
that's
it's
fine.
interesting because, think about even the one that does, in Jumanji, this one, they don't even bother to explore. Like in the first movie, they felt the need to make it clear that, like, to raise the stakes to your point, so that the stakes weren't just like, oh, these couple of kids are trapped in this board game, or one kid was trapped in this board game. It's this entire town and community have been destroyed because of this board game. Whereas the new one, the only thing that has been destroyed is like the one dude's house.
Hmm.
It's just one dude. They call it the creep house or whatever,
Yeah.
which I thought was really good.
Hmm.
And so that's the only thing that's been affected by the video game version of Jumanji. Nothing else has changed.
Hmm.
There's an interesting sort of question here, I think, about why they felt the need in the 96 movie to basically make it It's a Wonderful Life with a board game. Whereas this one didn't feel the need to do that. There's something interesting there.
Yeah, I mean, and it's also part of the plot of the movie too, is that the game comes out to destroy the world, and you know, you don't have that. It seems like
I
the
didn't get the. I never got. See, I feel bad for the game. I don't think the game's out to destroy the world. I think the game just wants to entertain people. It just doesn't know quite how to do it. Like I really feel like I think it's
Mhm,
just there. It's just like, no, come on, we're here to play. Like
mhm,
you're here to enjoy the adventure, the experience. You're here to escape from the real world.
mhm.
And it can't get played with in the 90s anymore because people don't want to play the board game. So it evolves Pokemon style into a video game. You know,
Mhm.
I didn't see the game as nefarious at all. I thought the game was there to make sure people were entertained, that they enjoyed, that they had adventure in their lives.
Yeah, but then the 96 version, there is this idea they have to keep playing because otherwise the game will just keep destroying things, right? There's no other reason why they have to keep playing, is there? You know, that was my thought, was like this thing is just going to keep exercising its pernicious upon the world unless you,
Yeah, but
you
does the game see them as that way, or does the game see these as part of the adventure?
well, why would the game compel you to, oh, I guess the game would compel you to complete it because it would allow, that's the
Because it's
adventure.
the game. You have
Yeah.
to play the game.
Now, from the game's perspective, it's not trying to, you know,
That is its
hurt
telos. Its
anyone.
telos is to be played. It
It's to be
must be
played.
played.
You think it'd be a little gentler about it, but yeah. Yeah, that's a good point. Like the game itself is neutral, or it's even kind of thinks of itself as giving a benefit, but its benefit is completely destructive to anyone
To
in the
everyone
world.
who uses it.
Yeah.
That's people's fault.
Yes. uh,
But that is a big difference between the 95 version and the Dwayne Johnson one, is in the 95 one and in the children's book, the game comes to the players, right? They come into our world. In the Dwayne Johnson ones, the players go into Jumanji.
It's a big difference. I think it's in some ways related to the problem thing we were talking about before, that the first one is much more about the community. It's much more about the way the community is affected. Because in some ways, there actually isn't much to the characters in the first one. Alan Parrish is a kid. He has been a little scarred by living in the jungle. That's about all we get of him.
hmm.
You know, the girl has almost zero character except that she was scarred by him getting sucked into the game. The two children, a little. I mean, I love the fact that the Kirsten Dunst character
Yeah.
lies all the time. I think her lies are
Yes.
hysterical. Again, that made me laugh.
Mhm.
That was very funny. And the boy is traumatized by the death of his parents. So they have some characteristics, but they don't really have a lot of character. It's more about like the community as a whole and how it's been affected by this whole thing. Whereas in the 2017 one, there's almost no sense at all that that kid disappeared 20 years ago and had no effect on anyone except his own father.
Mhm.
Um, and then, you know, they get sucked into the game, and the only thing that's affected by it is their own personality and everything like that. There's actually is, I think, a significant shift away from community emphasis to emphasis on the individual, which again maybe speaks to developments that happened in the 20 years intervening.
Yeah. Yeah, and the way the individual is highlighted is something that you couldn't do quite to the same extent in the 90s, or certainly not in the 80s, which is with video games you can take on a role much better. You can take on a new character. And that's what this is. You explore character by no longer being the person you used to be. And so that highlights those characteristics those characteristics you lost, right? So, uh, Brittany, um, Bethany, uh, you know, she becomes kind of an
Brittany, Bethany, Timberly, Emily.
whatever blonde lady, blonde cheerleader type. She becomes this man who's not attractive, and so she loses that and ends up having to develop a respectable or admirable personality out of that. And so what you said, God, it's all about the characters. It moves from community to character. And that's the case with all of them, where they're really forced to confront their own personalities by being put into a skin that no longer, or forces them to deal with their personality flaws, right? Like Fridge becomes small and weak. He's only been this football guy.
Mouse.
Yeah. And now he has to be, the little guy, etc. Which is, yeah, pretty, it's a pretty good way to highlight character or bring forward character over community, as you're saying, Pat. And yeah, I think there's and it's also the engine of the movie, the reason why you watch the movie, I think, is because the actors who are playing these characters are kind of larger than life, right? I think Dwayne Johnson. You can't watch this movie without watching a Dwayne Johnson movie or having Dwayne Johnson as himself a reference. He's not playing Bravestone. He's Dwayne Johnson because he's Dwayne Johnson in everything he does. He's always that person. And so the fantasy is, if you could be Dwayne Johnson, what would that bring out in you? What kind of person? How would you adapt to that circumstance? And that movie does not work without Dwayne Johnson. You'd have to have an equally ridiculous,
Charismatic, strong,
charismatic.
self-aware,
Yeah,
goofy, right?
it's very much about the cultural references to other Dwayne Johnson stuff.
But it's the same thing with Jack Black, I'd say. I mean,
And with Jack
it's
Black
like it's a
too.
similar thing is going on with him, and same with Kevin Hart. I think those at least those three serve as definitive sort of cultural touchstones that you can pinpoint. Um, Karen, is it Gilliam? I can't remember her last name.
Gillian or Gilliam.
Gilliam. I only know her as the Doctor Who girl. So with her, like I think she has like a presence. I think she's sort of well known, but she doesn't have quite the sort of she doesn't carry quite as much of her own personal and historical kind of character record with her, and Nick Jonas doesn't really at all. So the three of them though sort of serve as the main points. I think anyway. But you're right. I think they bring their own characters and selves with them in it.
Mm-hmm.
Gillian was great, but if that was Scarlett Johansson, that would have been a perfect four right there. Right? She would have been playing herself from Black Widow.
Oh, I see. Yeah, possibly. Yeah, but I agree. I think that that Jack Black is equally as you say, that they're cultural touchstones, but they're cultural touchstones who are individuals, and that's part of this kind of transformation or what have you.
One of the things we talked about during one of the Back to the Future episodes on Talking Pictures Trivia was the idea that the town square used to be a spot where the community would come together to share news, to hang out. And one of the conclusions we came to, whether it was true or not, is we don't go to the town square anymore. We go online. That's where our town square is now. So if we're talking about community, it's interesting that in Welcome to the Jungle, the characters get put into a place where their community is not accessible because you can't get online from the jungles of Jumanji. So you're cut off from the society, from your community.
And I think that speaks maybe to the anxieties that have evolved between 95 and 2017, is that 95 you're still in a world where community is in person, right? And 2017 community becomes this individual thing. You could just do it by yourself through communications online. And granted, maybe not doing it by yourself if you're talking to other people or gaming or what have you. So it's that type of it's that type of transformation as well. I mean, we were talking about the global village too before, that concept that eventually there was this idea that once people kind of went online, there would be a sort of universal culture that would evolve, and and that was hypothesized in like the 80s. And I don't know if they thought of online exactly in the same way, but still pretty good. This idea of universal connection. And the consequence of that wasn't a global village; it was global towns, like these little town squares, but we're extremely distant. So you could form a town square over basically like Iranian movies if you wanted to. That having a town square was an individual action, as opposed to an action that involved kind of going out and making it with the people around you.
I mean, I would agree. The problem with that theory, though, and I agree, it's absolutely true. That's sort of what has happened. But the problem with that is that you can very easily drop out of the community that you've joined. You can join it very easily, and you can drop out of it very easily, which effectively gives it no actual value or meaning. That's sort of the problem. Whereas in sort of a physical community, it's fairly difficult to get yourself there and to get yourself out. Like, yes, you obviously can physically move, and it's a lot easier now than it was, say, 60, 70 years ago to move, but it's still fairly difficult to do that based on physical location. And so there is a certain level of value that gets associated with it because of that.
But I think that's what the movie's doing, right? I think the
Yeah.
movie is about like that you can drop completely out of any community, and
Yeah.
eventually that manifests in the game where these people fall out of anything, um, and therefore they have to develop as people in order to find. They actually have to make a community amongst their high school friends. People who might not have shared interests, but whatever, they're people who are physically close to you, whose house you can actually go to. They have to reestablish that in order to get away from this like online culture, dropout culture type thing. I think that's maybe part of that. May be the anxiety that's developed between 95 and 2017 that movie is capturing. We talked a little bit about this kind of idea of something. Well, we were talking in text a little bit about this idea of uh, this might be the first adaptation where we're seeing an expansion, where the book is just has less content, has less stuff, and it kind of blows up. Normally, it's the book has a lot of content, and you have to, at least in terms of narrative or plot, scale it down in order to make something. This is an exception, and it seems like children's books are that exception, or the kind of adaptation type that has to go through this unusual process. Another thing we were talking about offline was how do we define the 2017 version vis-a-vis the 1995? If we consider the 1995 an adaptation of the book, is the 2017 one a sequel or something else? How do we categorize it? So which one of these questions do we want to, or inquiries do we want to explore first?
In some ways, I'd say we could touch on them at the same time because I think they're somewhat related. Because the first one is obviously a direct. It's an I mean, it is an adaptation, but it's a yeah. So I guess when I think about children's books, there's two routes you can sort of go with, and you can see them. Take something like The Grinch. The Grinch, the original one, just took pretty much the actual Grinch and just translates it into, the cartoon, and it's more or less the book. They do make some variations to it. They make some changes to it, but that's pretty much it's almost word for word, just narrated from the book. Um, and I think that was a lot more common maybe 50, 60 years ago. Like, the idea was like, well, you're not just going to go take The Grinch and turn it into a feature-length movie. You don't need to. Just make it into a short movie and you can, make it as a TV special or make it as something else. Nowadays, I've seen the jokes that talk about like if they made Lord of the Rings now, it would be like 9 movies long. It would have been massive. There is this trend to basically take it's like, oh, I've got a good idea. I gotta stretch this thing out. Like I gotta make
Mhm.
this into a full length
You got to make it into a
feature.
franchise.
Yeah, I gotta try to make this a thing. And so you can see that in sort of the two modern versions of the Grinch. I think that, which with there's this weird attempts to sort of, in the Dr. Seuss feels absolutely no need to give a reason why the Grinch, in fact, he says, he's like, no one knows why the Grinch is the way he is. But the movies are like, yes, we do. We're going to tell you for 45 minutes. So there's this sense of like, you have to take these things and expand them out. With the Jumanji, I don't think you really could make that into a very good short film because it's sort of begging you to fill it in. There's this sense that there's a lot more to that book that wants to be told. And so while I have some issues with how they expanded it, the way the actual movie is fairly entertaining. If they sort of I think if they'd slimmed it down a little bit and kind of adjusted the pacing and kind of got the tone right, it could have been a really, really, really good movie. It's still pretty good, but they have to almost expand it to make it a movie. I don't think you could even make it a short film. I think there's a case where some movies have been made and been stretched out. I've mentioned Polar Express already. I think that should have just been a 30, 45-minute short up that was basically the book. By blowing it up into this massive thing, it just became a little strange to my opinion. But, in that one it works. But I think with the 2017 one, it's almost because I mean they're presenting it as a sequel, but it's really not. I mean, other than a couple nods to Alan Parrish, where they're like, "We're living in," and they even pause the camera, like, "We're only here, Alan Parrish built this house. We're only living in it." pause. You know, I'm like, yeah, we got it. You know, there's this, it's homages to it, but realistically, you don't need the first movie at all. You could just have this thing operate exactly as it is. Um,
Yeah, it's only important for the branding and marketing. It's so
yeah,
It's
weird,
IP.
right?
it's
Yeah.
IP, and so in that sense, there's almost a sense that this isn't even it's a modernization almost of it because it's true. People, you know, board games are out there, but you know, it's a little difficult to picture a bunch of teenagers sitting around playing. Although actually, I shouldn't say that because like Settlers of Catan and all
Yeah,
sorts of
they're
like
just
there's
different now. It's not
they're totally
Monopoly. It's
different. You
yeah.
know, like you wouldn't see people just rolling dice and moving pegs around a board. They just wouldn't do it. So it's almost unbelievable what they would. But this sense of the video game thing is a total modernization, and it works really well.
And the video game jokes are spot on. I mean, they're
Oh, they're
yeah,
hilarious. It's really funny.
like the lives, NPCs, the cutscene.
The cutscene,
Yeah, I
yeah.
think we're in a cutscene. Well, my favorite is when because there's a sense here which I actually and I can't quite tell if they were doing this on purpose, but it happens a few times where they try to think originally, like how would we approach this in real life? And they're like, we would have, you know, the hot one go down and flirt with them down there. Like, let's do that to distract them. And it doesn't work at all because the NPCs are programmed for it.
Right.
So there's a couple times where they try to do something out of the box, and it's like, yeah, it doesn't work because the NPCs are programmed to do it. And that scene was really funny. Like, hello, little lady, what are you doing all the way out here? And then she tries to, and then they just like, hello, little lady, what are you doing? Like, it's just like that was very funny because that does kind of happen in games. Like, you try to do something and the game won't let you do it, and the NPCs just keep saying the same scripted line back at you.
And audience, if you like that, check out our other podcast, Limited Lexicon, where that's basically the entire podcast is us trying to do real things.
Trying to talk to
NPCs saying the same
NPCs.
things over and over.
But I mean, if they had only thrown in a reference to like, you know, I used to be an adventurer like you, and then I took an arrow in the knee. Like it's basically that sort of joke, and
Mhm.
it works very well. I think it's very funny.
Mhm.
Going back to the expansion for the 95 one, I think they took a pretty big risk in that it starts in the 1700s. So we spend a little bit of time there. Then it goes to the 1960s. We spend a good chunk of time there. And then we're not introduced to the kids who the audience is supposed to relate to until almost 20 minutes into the film. And I can't imagine that was common in kids' films back in the day that you had two prologues before you got to cool 90s stuff happening.
Yeah, it's a long, long sequence in order to get to the game. I mean, I appreciate that the it's being buried in the, you know, long, long time ago or whatnot. Um, though I'm trying to remember, what did 17th century people think of the jungle? But anyway, but it does take a long time. Like we get Alan's whole family and the bullies, and then there's the sneaker thing, and then you know, it takes a while for us to get to the actual horror, which I more or less found a little frustrating. But
It's a pretty big risk though in a kids movie, right? That could have sunk the movie for kids if it wasn't
yeah,
done, if it wasn't paced
mhm,
correctly or
yeah.
It is a good question. I mean, because there's a good point in that. Because is it just like would if you showed? I wonder if I showed that movie to many modern kids, would they put up with it? I don't
Mhm.
actually know. I don't because I've never. I don't know if kid people show that movie to their kids these days, or
Mhm.
whether they would just show the modern one.
Yeah. No, I don't know.
Because it is fairly slow paced. Like it's just the pacing is a bit it's a bit chaotic, but that beginning is, you're right, very slow.
There's so many like Chekhov guns they have to point at, right? They have to
Yeah.
introduce the game, then they have to introduce the guy in the store, the guy in the shoe shop. They have to introduce the sneaker that goes on the conveyor belt. They have to like introduce the dad being a difficult dad, and then the bullies and the girl, and you know, there's just all these things that need to be, all these guns that need to be loaded.
Yep.
It's
Who was the dude that was living in the factory that gave him the coat?
that I thought at first it was the
Was I supposed to
dad.
know who he
Yeah, I
was?
thought so too. I was like, that is somebody we're gonna meet later, but we never did.
Okay, so I wasn't wrong. I didn't know if
I didn't
that
know
was
who
one
it
where I was
was.
missing.
I first I
Yeah,
thought it was the
no idea.
dad. I was trying to
I
look
thought
him
it was
up.
the dad too, but
Yeah.
I was like, no, the dad's running around with a gun.
Yeah.
It's
The
like,
dad is Van Pelt, which I actually like the joke Van Pelt. You know,
yes.
yeah, that was good. Um, but yeah, so it is a long, long opening.
So, as for a sequel, there's a big plot flaw, and if Nick was here, I think he'd bring it up. I believe at the end of the Robin Williams
Oh
one,
God, yeah.
the Jumanji board ends up in France on the beach in 1996. However, at the beginning of the Dwayne Johnson one, it's 1996, and presumably they're in the northeast of the United States on a beach. How did the game get to France and back in less than a year through the
I
ocean?
they didn't.
Maybe it was just in Montreal.
Oh, maybe it went
Yeah.
up to French
Yeah,
Canada and then back
it went.
down.
It made it. They were on the Great Lakes. It floated out
Or
there.
yeah, maybe Colin Hanks was jogging in French Canada on the beach and took it back with him
All the way back.
to New England.
Hey, check out this thing.
Or was it his brother who found it? I actually don't
I
remember.
thought it was his
I think-
dad, but
Oh, is it the dad who found it?
Maybe the
Somebody's
French
jogging
dad.
on the
It's probably
beach
somebody was
French dad.
jogging on a beach
and picked it up. Yeah. I thought it was maybe the
And-
brother. Anyway, yeah.
and apparently jogged back with it, like, clattering the
Yeah.
whole way back.
Uh-huh.
The drums.
Yeah.
But then that whole sequence and then having the fifth guy in the game felt like a throwback to the Robin Williams movie, but it did not fit in the movie. It felt very forced to me that they were doing that at all.
What was forced?
The idea that, oh, we need to have the character that's from 24-ish years ago in this movie
Oh.
because that's what happened in the first movie. And we needed to have the dad who was, distraught because he lost his child. Like, it felt like someone was like, no, you got to put that into the movie because otherwise it's even less of a Jumanji movie. And I don't think it worked. I don't think it fit in the Dwayne Johnson movie.
I think it would have fit better if they hadn't even shown it.
Right.
I think it would have been better because when I first saw it, I didn't. So actually, I must not have seen it on a plane because when I first saw it, I didn't see the first part. I only saw the part where they're in detention and they're like, we can't pick that one. It must be broken. And, my head, I wasn't really thinking about it. And then they went through it. And then when they finally found him, they're like, you're the missing character and everything. I'm like, oh, that's pretty clever, actually. Like, that's kind of cool to have that idea of somebody having played it years before and been trapped in there. They should have just done that. I think they should have completely cut the opening because I, having seen it that way, hadn't seen the original until I watched it the second time, hadn't seen that opening part. I think it works better that way. It works much more entertainingly, not knowing why they can't pick the character and just kind of dismissing that as like, okay, whatever, I guess they can't pick that character.
And then make him somebody who speaks French. And now you're tired. It's all.
And now it's all good.
You could still have the freak house, and then it's just later you see it's
Yeah.
not the freak house, and they do that whole thing.
Yeah, I mean, you could just have it be that the freak house is there, that people are scared of this dude. No one
Mhm.
really knows why. You
Yep.
can just have it just sit there and even be that like this kid disappeared and you don't really, have to acknowledge it. But by actually seeing the fact that he did go into the game, you're now waiting for him to show up.
Right.
It feels better to me if you don't know he's in there and then he shows up in the game and then they're like, oh my gosh, now we know who you are. And the audience gets that reveal too, rather than just the characters getting it. It's more fun if the audience gets it and the characters get it.
Yeah, I suppose the reason you have it too is to show how the game becomes a video game, which is
True.
also a little silly. Like, why do we need this? Why do we
Yeah,
need
we don't
to?
need it. You don't need
Why
it
do
at
we
all.
need this continuity thing that's going on to make it an honest sequel?
That's why I would have, if I was doing this, I would have treated it as a true modernization. It's not a sequel; it's just a modernization. That's it. You get to see this as this. It's a video game now. Who cares how it got here? You don't need to care about that. Does anybody care?
Yeah, I suppose it's trying to function as a sequel in the sense of, for the reason that the audience who are going to it are people who are probably 10 to 14 years old or even younger, maybe 8 to 12 years old, who saw Jumanji at that age when it first came out. And so by having these kind of connections, you have that sort of dopamine release of, oh, I remember that when I was a kid, and now we're going to take this thing I really like and move it into this other space. So it's, as a viewer, it becomes this. As a viewer, you sort of make it a sequel, or you need it to be a sequel because you need to make those connections to that experience you had when you were young and first saw it. I think if you're not a fan of the movie or didn't experience the movie as a kid, it's just sort of like, why is this here? Well, it's trying to do a lot of this work for the viewer, which is not that, it's it's these kind of like what we call like intertextual references to other material in order to create this kind of web that includes the audience, right? It's like, we are all having this Jumanji experience, and now we're having this Jumanji experience with the new technology that you're all gaming with. So I think that's the idea of what makes it a sequel. If we call it a sequel, it probably isn't, but it's a new repurposing of the IP. But instead of just making it a modernization and having not even calling it Jumanji, calling it something else, you call it Jumanji because you can capture that audience, even though the new movie has nothing to do with the old movie and certainly nothing to do with the book. I think that's what's going on there. But I don't know what to call it. Would you call it a sequel?
In a strict sense, it wants to be that. I mean,
Yeah.
that's what it is. It is trying to create temporal continuity. So I
Mhm.
think you'd.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think technically it's a sequel, but it does not feel like a sequel.
Yeah, and
No.
it's odd. It's like what makes something a sequel is that it attempts to build an in-world narrative. That doesn't even work, right? Because you mentioned they're in France somewhere at the end of the 95 version, and now it's just back here in presumably New England.
There could just be French people in New Hampshire. Like there were just a couple
There
of French
cannot be.
children.
No.
There is no suggestion here that it has to be France. That was the suggestion given at the end of the film.
Mhm.
There
Yeah.
could just be very precocious children.
No, fair enough. Yeah, but I was looking at like other things where you sort of repurpose older material for a new thing. I was thinking like something like Wide Sarcoso Sea, if anybody's read that. It's basically it's a sort of prequel to Jane Eyre, and it's the story of the mad woman in the attic when she's in her plantation in the Caribbean. And it functions as a prequel, officially. I mean, it's written by a different author in a different century. But it's sort of like, well, what makes that a prequel? What gives that continuity with the original? Because Jean Rhys, who wrote it, she's attempting to respect the continuity of it. But the book is an utterly different tone. It's sort of like stream of consciousness. The sympathies of the author are completely different. In Jane Eyre, the author is not sympathetic to the mad woman in the attic. She's kind of like a problem that needs to be gotten rid of. And in Wide Sarcoso Sea, she is this source of sympathy. And so like the communication between those texts is really interesting because it's functioning as a prequel, but it's doing like radically different things with I guess we could call the IP, even though I don't think Jane Eyre is protected by intellectual property. But that's what I was thinking of when watching this. I'm like, how is Wide Sargasso Sea regarded in terms of continuity, and this is also regarded in continuity. To say Wide Sargasso Sea is a prequel to Jane Eyre seems like you're missing something in saying that, and yet, kind of technically, it is. I mean, there's nothing changed about it. I mean, I think calling it a modernization might be more accurate, but it's still respecting continuity and all that.
Mind if I throw out some other examples and we can just decide if they fall in the boat or not? Ghostbusters Afterlife. Have you
I
guys seen
didn't see it.
It was a
Is that the new
2021.
one?
Yeah,
But
2021.
No, I didn't
I haven't
see
seen
it.
it.
that's attempting to form continuity, right? It's not like the one with it's not like the Ghostbusters with the female cast.
Right, it's not the 2016 one. It's not Answer the Call. This
Mhm.
is the one with the kid from Stranger Things and Paul Rudd. But if you guys
Mhm.
haven't seen it, all right, we'll move on. Blade
Haven't seen
Runner
it.
2049.
I've seen it.
So it's sequel, but it didn't feel like it was the same themes. Didn't feel like it was.
I feel like there's same themes in 2049, Blade Runner
Yeah.
2049.
Okay. Mad
Yeah.
Max Fury Road. Similar themes actually, but
And it's also the Mad Maxes are somewhat reimaginings.
every time anyway.
It's like this, it's odd. Mad Max is like an archetype. It's like a bunch of archetypes. Mad Max is sort of an archetype, but the world is roughly the same. It's
Right.
sort of or more post-apocalyptic.
You're right. More or less sometimes. Yeah. And then I'll throw another one out. Coming to America.
That seems like an honest sequel.
Yeah, you think so? Okay. I just the 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 original felt like an 80s R-rated comedy. Coming to America didn't take place in New York. It kind of took place in a mansion. The jokes weren't the same style as the original. It felt like, but
Yeah, I suppose when we're talking about sequels now, what we're doing is purely putting that weight on narrative, right? On plot. The plot, not even narrative, I should just say plot. Like a sequel or a prequel is a continuation or a backwards look at the plot of this thing. And we could do a different tone, we could do a different mood. Um, but as long as it's continuing, then we're all
sequel.
good.
Yep.
Which is an odd thing, right? Because, like, would you say, well, this wouldn't be a good example, but would you like what would be the relationship between Ulysses and the Odyssey, right? The Joyce book and the Odyssey. It's sort of like it's it's the same. Is it the same plot? I mean, you
It's
could.
a framing. I would
It's a
call that a
frame.
framing
Yeah,
device. I would call that a framing
mhm.
device more than anything. But
But it's still like you don't get it unless you get the plot of
yeah,
Ulysses
this is true.
the Odyssey rather. You don't get Ulysses unless you get the plot of the Odyssey. Like the I section, just the joke is over your head. There's a lot of jokes that are over your head if you just don't know the Odyssey or don't even realize that's what he's doing. And so it's not a sequel, but in order to really follow the narrative, you need this other material. I think that's true with Wide Sargasso Sea. In order to follow what Jean Rhys is doing in Wide Sargasso Sea, you need to know Jane Eyre, and not just because of narrative continuity or whatnot. I think with Coming to America, the sequel to Coming to America, it's not. They're not. It's the same thing. It's you can watch that movie independently of its original, but it's still doing the same thing with narrative. Um, but it's not like I would say you have an easier time watching the sequel to Coming to America and getting as much enjoyment as possible to get out of that movie, which isn't very much, um, than you would with reading Ulysses by James Joyce and not knowing anything about the Odyssey. Like you're pretty much fine on the first one. And the second one, you're kind of not having the experience. Um, and I think there is this other dimension to like sequel making or connections or continuity in which like you as a reference point, you have to kind of make the web, right? Like in a lot of these things, it's a difference between is this just a continuation of the story? And in Jumanji 2017, you don't need the earlier material to enjoy Jumanji 2017, and basically to get everything you need out of it. Like if you want to like be nostalgic and remember the 95 version, if you have nostalgia feelings for the 95 version, great. That's what's going to get butts in the seats. That's what's selling it. But basically, that movie works completely independently. And like you're saying, Pat, if you just made it a modernization and called it Numani instead of Jumanji or whatever stupid word you want to put in there, it works just as well. It just is. It's a harder pitch probably to get it produced because these things cost so much. But I think with these other kind of retellings or modernizations, you kind of need the original thing. I think like East of Eden by John Steinbeck. You kind of need to know we're doing a Genesis story here. You're pretty dull if you don't pick it up pretty quickly, actually. But I think there's this kind
Thanks,
of
Tom.
well, did you read East of Eden?
No.
Oh,
Sorry. I watched the movie.
With James Dean.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Actually, I've read the book. I haven't watched the movie.
Movie's fun.
No,
Movie's better than the book.
mm-hmm.
But
Oh, is it?
I just
Yeah, I don't like
Steinbeck.
Steinbeck either.
I
I
just don't like Steinbeck.
I read like 6 Steinbeck novels in a row, going like, what am I missing? I have to like the next one has to be the one that is the reason why everybody likes.
I think if he hadn't won the Nobel Prize, I don't know if people would still be reading him. And he only won the Nobel Prize because they couldn't decide between Graham Greene and Isaac Dinesen.
No,
And supposedly
that's
it was down
supposedly
to
it.
the three. Yeah, it was the three of them, and half of them wanted Isaac Dinesen, and half of them wanted Graham Greene, and they wouldn't budge, and so they just gave up and picked Steinbeck supposedly that year.
No, well, I love reading banned book justifications for John Steinbeck because he's banned so frequently and completely different political opinions want to ban him. Like it's very funny to watch. Like, why did this town ban him? Oh, you're into like this politics, and this town is into the complete opposite politics, and also ban the same book. So there's this really odd like tension where it's like a sequel is about continuing the narrative and being pretty faithful to the narrative, but there's this whole other realm of like, I don't know, interconnection between works in which it's, I don't like, you have to actually know the narrative more in order to understand it.
I'm curious, KJ, have you played BioShock 3?
Is that BioShock Infinite?
Yes, BioShock Infinite.
I
That's what it's actually called,
started
yeah.
it.
I'm just curious, like, I mean, because that's an interesting one where it calls itself. I mean, it's clearly meant to be, and there's like some really
Mm.
oblique references
Mm-hmm.
to the first two. I forgot they called it BioShock Infinite. I did play it through, and it sort of gets a bit, it gets very meta. Um,
Okay.
uh, it's literally a game about video games as it continues
Oh.
along.
Well, and I only played the first few hours, so that is an interesting thought about a sequel because I think
Because is it a sequel?
thematically, I think it does something similar. So the original BioShock is, hey, there was a libertarian utopia that fell apart, and now you're picking its bones and going through. When I was playing Infinite, it felt like they were setting up for a communistic, communistic utopia that's about to fall apart, and you're going to be picking the bones of a. I don't know if that's where it went, but that's what it felt like to me. It felt like the inverse of the first game.
Yeah, BioShock 2 was more that. BioShock
Oh,
1
okay.
was meant to be the extreme libertarian, all about the individual, and that society falls apart. BioShock 2 was supposed to be it's all about the community. It's
Ah.
going to be the only thing that will exist. That we will abandon the individual entirely for the sake of the community, was BioShock 2. BioShock Infinite was sort of this very different.
Hmm.
BioShock Infinite was meant as this sort of jingoistic, imperialistic, late 19th century exceptionalism exploration, and sort of where that goes wrong. But the idea is often what they do though is they take these things of, let's take a political idea to its absolute extreme in some sort of isolated society, give it some sort of wild technology that's just clearly going to be a problem, and watch how they destroy themselves.
Mm-hmm.
That's essentially what what they do with them all. The first two though are clearly, you if you play BioShock 2 without playing BioShock 1, I can't imagine you have a clue what the heck is going on. It would make no sense. But BioShock Infinite is pretty much standalone. Like there's like maybe one or two references that are sort of like they'll glimpse something from BioShock, or there's some suggestions that some of the technology is taken from that universe and moved into this world. But for the most part, you could easily play this and chalk those up to being like, well, I don't know what that was, because you don't know what half the stuff is. It's meant to just be completely baffling. But a few of the things you could look at and be like, oh, I know what that is. You know, and so it's meant to sort of function that way. So is it really a sequel? I always wondered that. I was curious. I've never actually had the discussion with anybody. Is it a sequel, or is it just, well, we had an idea for a game and it was easier to just call it BioShock because we could sell
Sell
it?
it. I think it's a great comparison to the Jumanji movies.
Yeah.
I really do. Because you're like the branding, sure, and maybe the team, sure, the physics engine, maybe. Well, BioShock 1 and 2 was like PS3, 360,
Yeah.
and then Infinite
Yeah,
was the
one was just
next
the first one was
gen.
just regular BioShock. Second was 360. No, the first and the second were 360. Yeah, and then
Was Infinite the next gen? So it would have been another
no, the next one might have still been 360.
same. So maybe
But
it's
then
the
it
same
came out in
engine,
2013,
or
so it was still 360. Actually, they
okay.
were all 360.
So it
They
could
had
have
the
been.
same
And it might have been
IP.
Xbox One. I don't remember. I'm gonna think this is like
Mhm.
this is 11 years ago. I can't remember where the systems came out. It might have been just
Just
transitioning
on
to
the
Xbox
on
One.
the edge.
It
Okay.
might have just been
Mhm.
transitioning to Xbox One.
I do. I think that's a great comparison to the Jumanji movies. It's a very similar idea.
Yeah, I suppose it's is the world the same in all the BioShocks?
I mean, technically, yes. In BioShock, so BioShock 1 and 2, absolutely same world, no question about it. Same world, same, same general schematic, like everything's exactly the same. BioShock 3, it's very similar gameplay. The gameplay, although you got the skyhook, which is really fun. You can go around and drop down on top of people and shoot them. But anyway, generally speaking, it's got slightly different gameplay, but more or less, it's exactly the same. They do make some like oblique references to the original two games, and there's a suggestion that the worlds are linked. In BioShock Infinite, the idea is like you can travel between worlds. This one character has the ability to travel between alternate universes,
Mhm.
and there's a suggestion that in one of the alternate universes is the BioShock universe,
Mhm.
and they take some things from the BioShock universe into this universe is the suggestion, but
Mhm.
it's never. I think in one of the expanded, in one of the like downloadable contents, they make it much more clear. Like you can actually go into the BioShock world and walk around with
Mhm.
it with the characters from BioShock Infinite. But for the most part, in the original game, it's not 100% clear that they are exactly the same. It's only sort of suggested, and you see some glimpses of it.
Yeah, Tom, 1 and 2 take place deep under the sea, and Infinite takes
Mhm.
place up in the sky, like in a sky village.
But they're all in dialogue. It sounds like they're in dialogue with each other. So continuity isn't the thing. There's a different kind of dialogue going
Yes,
on,
and that's
right?
the question
That's the
is,
thing.
and
Does
that
the
was their argument.
dialogue
That's exactly their
make a
argument.
sequel, right? And that's yeah. Does the fact that these three things are not only using the same IP, which is there to, I guess, like sell the object, which is fine, fair enough. But it's also probably there to be like, okay, these things are in conversation with each other. What is that giving you? Like you as the receiver have to kind of do that work as to does this mash do something or give you something? Well, I think when you're watching a sequel like let's not use Coming to America because they have the same title, but like RoboCop and RoboCop 2, it's just you don't have to really do that work of networking it, right? It's just this is the next thing that happens to RoboCop in Detroit, or I didn't see the movie, but or wherever that takes place. And there you go. You could just sort of follow along with it. You could be a passive onlooker. Well, I think in like what you're saying, Pat, in the BioShock world, you probably have to have experienced these different things, and you make the connections yourself. They're available to you to make. And I think that's true of Ulysses with Odysseus. It's like here's a bunch of illusions. You are the recipient of them. You can make them or you can fail to. I don't really care. Hope you do, because then you'll get more out of the book, but whatever. And I think that may be the difference between kind of a sequel and just a sort of, this kind of network system is how these works relate to the audience. Right. And I think that's kind of Jumanji's kind of doing that to a degree. It's taking, but it's more interested in just preserving the IP, I think, in order to sell its movie. Though it is a similar concept. It's game coming out to get you, or you going into the game, and the game is this force you have to overcome.
So, Tom, you brought up RoboCop, and it's kind of an interesting one because the first RoboCop movie is a commentary on violence and destruction, whereas the second RoboCop movie, I believe, is more what you'd expect with a robot cop just killing people. I don't think there's that.
They lost the joke.
Right,
They
right.
forgot it was a
But
joke.
it made me think of another series.
That's an important part of it. They forgot it was a joke.
Right. Well, but have you guys seen Bring It On, the cheerleading movie?
I
I
saw
have.
The first movie is
the first
great.
one.
The first
Mhm.
movie it's not what you expect from a cheerleading movie, but the second and third one are just, oh, that squad and this squad, and they're competing. It doesn't matter. But the first, so when you started about RoboCop, the first thing that popped in my head was, oh yeah, Bring It On does that too. They lose the.
They lose the joke. Yeah.
It's actually a number of movies I'm thinking about that have that problem where it's like the first one was making some sort of joke commentary on the genre that it was supposed to be,
Mhm.
and then it was so successful that people made the sequel and they didn't remember that it was a joke. I
Mhm.
feel like that happens relatively frequently.
Yeah. I'm trying to. I can't think. Did they make Starship Troopers 2? I don't think I saw Starship Troopers 2 if they made it, but
I think they did.
yeah, because Starship Troopers is definitely a joke, and that's actually an interesting one because the
Dude, that
book
would be a
it's
fun one to do someday.
that
Yeah.
would be because the book is
The
not a
book is
joke.
no, the book is totally serious
Yeah,
from
the
what
book
I've
is
heard.
like, this is you respect the military and these people are doing good work, and then Actually, they're both actually RoboCop and Starship Troopers are directed by the same person.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah,
He
Paul
also did Bring It
Verhoeven's.
On. No, I'm just kidding.
Yeah, I mean that would have been really cool.
Well, he did Striptease, which is kind of like Bring It On, but a little more exciting.
More like
But
Bring It On 2. That's my point.
yeah, but you know that.
See, I saw Starship Troopers when I was probably like 14 years old, and I did not know that it was a joke and was kind of confused. by it. And it was definitely like, it kind of, I did not know it was a joke until years later. I'm like, well, that's why that movie was kind of unsettling. It was meant to be.
Yeah. Yeah, that's an interesting one where you keep the plot relatively the same, but you entirely change the not only
Tone.
the tone, yeah, and the purpose of it. Um, yeah, that would be an interesting one. Another thing that comes to mind is the Color trilogy. Have you guys seen this? It was done by
On my list. I really
yeah,
want to.
I've
I
never heard of it.
it's blue. It's the colors of the French flag. It's three movies: blue, white, and red. And I will say this: I am not saying to go out and watch these movies. I think they're kind of boring. But they're the colors of the red flag. The colors of the French flag are like liberty, um, equality,
Liberté,
and freedom.
fraternité, yeah.
Mhm.
Equalité, fraternité. I
Yeah,
can't do a French accent. I don't even know the words.
liberty, equality, fraternity, and
Yes,
each
we'll just
one.
go with the.
Yeah, and each one is like each story is an ironic version of that. So in the Liberty one, it's a woman gets in a car accident at the beginning of the movie and her family's killed and she's alone. But now she's, quote unquote, liberated or free. And each movie does something ironic with its theme. And there's a point in the third one, which is Red, where you see all the characters in one space at the same time, which is kind of corny. But outside of that, there's no connections between the characters. It's just three independent stories that are connected through, I don't even know if you call it a theme, this ironic repurposing of this idea of what it means to be French, I guess, right? And they're a trilogy, right? A trilogy is three stories. Each one is a sequel to the one before, and yet there's nothing sequential about it. And even if there is, it's completely inconsequential, right? It doesn't matter that one came before the other or whatnot. You could watch them basically in any order and get what they're doing. And so I think that's another thing where it's like, what makes something a sequel? Well, in this case, it isn't narrative at all. It's thematic connection, or it's a sense of irony. It's the way the guy uses irony makes something a sequel because he's using irony in the same way and is using this kind of, the French flag, the colors of the French flag, just to tie it together. So these things are supposed to be tied together, right? Because the casts aren't the same, so you wouldn't know otherwise. And that's another kind of question, like what makes that a sequel? Well, it's bound to something else. And that's it. It's bound to something else by a sense of irony. So that's another concept of a sequel that is kind of strange and sort of defies this idea of like narrative continuity, right? That doesn't work. It's not a continuous narrative.
Yeah, you're making me think of the Old Boy trilogy, and then
Mhm. Yeah, the Revenge trilogy, right?
the Revenge trilogy, and then what is it? Hot Fuzz. Shaun
Oh
of the
yeah,
Dead,
it's the ice cream they eat.
Cornado, yeah,
The Cornado trilogy, I think it is.
Cornado.
Yeah. And that's an
Didn't we
odd
do that with Dawn? What was the one with not Dawn of the Dead?
Shaun of the Dead?
The Shaun of the Dead one. Isn't
Yeah,
that what
that's
they did
one
with
of
that one?
those. Yeah.
Oh, is that one of them? Oh, okay.
Mhm. Yeah, they're named after, in each one of them they eat an ice cream that's Cornado or Cornado, whatever the brand of ice cream is in all three of them. And so they call it that trilogy. They call it after that. Which is kind of a loose association, but they're all tonally kind of the same. They're all sort of monster movies that are kind of silly comedies also, right?
I've only seen
two of them.
Shaun of the Dead.
I've only seen Shaun of the Dead.
I've seen Shaun of the Dead, and I saw the one with Timothy Dalton, the James Bond, which is about the police chief is going to make these like robotic zombies or something like that to take over the town. It's a very similar thing to Shaun of the Dead, except the threat is coming from a different direction, and it's a different kind of supernatural thing that's doing it. But there's similar plot constructions, and it's basically the director is coming out and saying, link these three things together and look at them as a set. And it's the loosest of things, right? It's in the movies, somebody will eat the ice cream that's the same brand of ice cream that they eat in these other movies. I mean, and yet we consider them a trilogy because some guy said they're a trilogy, right? The same guy made them. So it's just kind of an interesting concept that a sequel actually could have nothing to do with narrative whatsoever. We just have to. I mean, it's a sequel if we believe it's a sequel. That seems to be the conclusion here. Yeah, you can be a sequel if you believe in yourself. Yeah.
What do you think, audience? Let us know on Blue Sky at Talking Studios. Do you believe this episode is a sequel to the Super Mario Brothers episode?
I mean, they are video. We got video games in.
Yeah, there's a theme.
Yeah, that's true. But I don't know.
It's
those
intertextual,
are
I'm pretty sure.
It is intertextual, right? Because you're just creating intercodes. But the difference between if something is intertextual or is something sequential, or sequential is the wrong word, but a sequel or an adaptation, right? That's another thing. Is Ulysses an adaptation of the Odyssey? I think a lot of people would say yes, but it's not an adaptation in the sense of if you made a movie starring a guy named Odysseus who is, trying to get home to a wife who's being wooed by a bunch of people would be an adaptation.
I guess what I would throw out is this. I would have to say that with regards to what you've described as color trilogy, haven't seen it, so I can't say. But it doesn't sound to me like they are sequels. It sounds more like, they're a trilogy in the same sense that like a triptych is a single piece of art. Yeah, you can break them apart. You can break up a triptych into three different pieces, but realistically, in order to know what the whole thing does, you have to have the three together. So in that sense, some films can certainly talk to one another. They can be part of a trilogy or a duet or something like that. That doesn't necessarily make them a sequel. It just makes them part compositionally related or necessary to each other in order to understand the full point. But I don't think that makes them sequels. I would just say that makes them compositionally related. But sequel, to my mind, I just have a little bit of an issue because to my mind, sequel implies sequence.
Yeah, it's in the word.
It's in the word. It implies sequence. So it sort of implies that one has to follow the other. Now, one could follow the other and then go back in time, in the sense of like Chronicles of Narnia, the first book, you get 1, 2, 3, and then it goes back in time. For the later ones, I would still call it's a prequel, obviously, but again, there's an idea of like sequels almost necessarily have to involve time, and which implies narrative. You have to have narrative. You have to have
to push time.
Yeah, you have to have that. So in some ways, they're not sequels to one another. They're just compositionally related.
Tom, what was the play you were in that took place in the kitchen? You ate the butter.
Oh, the Norman. Oh, that's a good example. Yeah, the Norman conquests, the Norman conquests were a trilogy. We only did one of them, which doesn't make a lot of sense. But and I think both of you guys saw it, right?
You were there, Pat? I guess it was multiple nights.
Yeah.
Yeah, I went. I was there.
Yeah.
Oh, we could have met decades earlier.
Yeah. God, it was decades. No, it wasn't decades. Not decades.
Close, buddy. It was pretty close.
It's getting there.
It's getting really close.
Yeah. Oh God, the I think that was like, I don't think it was the nadir of my career. I think that was Tommen of Athens. That was the worst thing I've done. But
Tommen of Athens.
Yeah. Yeah.
Very, very few people, audience, have been in the play. Very few people have heard of the Shakespeare play Timon of Athens. Even fewer have been in it. And Tom is one of the only ones who's been in it twice.
Yes. Yes.
Tom and the Athens.
Tom and the Athens. Yeah. Well, the Norman Conquest is a good example because it's a trilogy of plays that each play takes place in a different room in this house that are all going on simultaneously. So you're playing a different game with time. You're not advancing time from play to play. You're seeing time beside one another. But they're still dependent on time. And actually that's the whole gag. The whole gag is if you read them or see them, you can see why this character comes in holding this item, right? It's like he's holding this weird thing. Why does he have that? There's no real answer. Oh, there's an answer in the other play because these things are going on next to each other. But it's still a relation of time. That's actually the whole joke, is that it's a relation of time. Yeah. And so was that the point you were bringing up?
Yep,
Yeah.
exactly. I couldn't remember much more about it than your performance, but yep.
Yeah, my stunning performance.
Mhm.
Yeah. But yeah, that's another example. But to Pat's point of there has to be a time element, it's sequential in some way. It is interesting because then compositional tightness is not necessary for sequels, right? You can get the entire picture with one of them, maybe not necessarily so, but with like a triptych, if you want to see the whole thing, you have to see all three of them, right? To get the image the artist insists upon, that the artist is trying to create. It isn't necessary with this sequel. The sequel could just be, the next chapter. It doesn't have to be made by the same artist.
Well, maybe. I mean, again, maybe not. I mean, you could have a triptych that is sequential in the sense that one panel leads to the next panel leads to the next panel. And so the third panel might make no sense if you don't know what the first two panels had in them.
Mhm.
So you could, something like The Godfather. Those are a trilogy. They're also sequels.
Mhm.
They're related to one another sequentially, so they're sequels to one another. They're also a trilogy. They exist compositionally as a whole. Um, I haven't
Mhm.
seen Godfather 3, but it's sort of this idea. Yeah, that's why I haven't seen it. That 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 face that the audience couldn't see is why I have not seen it. that everyone just made is why I have not seen it.
Mhm.
So, but I mean, they're sequels to one another, but they're also a trilogy. They exist, as a whole. It's difficult to sort of get them, or let's go with Star Wars or something like that. If you only saw Return of the Jedi, it would be hard to know what the heck's going on if you hadn't seen the first two. They're definitely sequels to one another, but it's also hard if you've only seen New Hope. You don't really know what the whole point of the story is, or what the arc of it's supposed to be in the same way. So I don't know if there's ever a case of films that, I mean, I guess there definitely are. There are films that are sequels to one another that are not compositionally whole, though. Again, the Jumanji one is probably a perfect example. They're technically sequels, but they are not compositionally related. You don't need to know one. So I think that maybe that's partially what the answer here is, that there's two different concepts going on here. One is, are they compositionally related? Does one speak to the other in terms of how they work? Which, to your example, Tom, of the Jane Eyre prequel, those are compositionally related and they're sort of prequels and sequels, but they're compositionally related. In order to get one, you have to know the other. And again, Ulysses and the Odyssey are compositionally related. They're not sequels, but they're compositionally related. But I think in this sense, the Jumanji films are sequels, but they're not talking to one another really,
Mhm.
other than reference and homage.
Mhm. Yeah, I think that's a good point. There's two vectors we're looking at: sequence and relation, or compositional relation. And sometimes you get them both, sometimes you only get one. Um, and yeah, and I think part of that's the reader. I mean, that's both the case with John Reese and with Joyce, is that the relationship is not something that was intended by the initial author, right? By Bronte or by
Yeah,
Homer,
it's true.
right? So you can actually create a compositional relationship that has nothing to do with what the original author intended. Um, I guess it's true of sequels too. You can continue the story in a new way. You can be they do it all the time, with new directors, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to get an entire picture when you see Jumanji and Jumanji the Dwayne Johnson one, and Jumanji the Next Level, or whatever the next one. It's called The Next Level, right?
Yep, that's the
Something
Jane
like
Eyre one.
That's the Jane Eyre one, yeah. Yeah, so that's that is that's an I wanted to, like, with that article I sent you guys with West Side Story as being related to Romeo and Juliet, because this idea of modernizing or a retelling, right? It's an adaptation, but it's also a modernization. We're going to tell the story of Romeo and Juliet, but in a way, I don't know, people in the 50s can relate to one another, even though I doubt anybody in the 50s actually acted like that. But, so that's, but yet the kind of, the idea there is that many people who see West Side Story will probably have that as their primary Romeo and Juliet experience. And so for them, it's not just you need, or to have the full experience, you need to know Romeo and Juliet in some way to understand what this movie is doing. Um, it's not only that, but the movie becomes a portal to understanding Romeo and Juliet. Romeo and Juliet almost becomes a version or an adaptation of West Side Story for the viewer who experiences that movie before they experience the play. And so by being a separate author who's coming along later and repurposing or adapting something else and creating a kind of distance or compositional distance that kind of begs for the two materials to come back together. As a reader, it's like it's interesting because your first experience with something can be the latter experience. It can be the thing that comes much later. Like you can experience Bronte through Wide Sargasso Sea. That could be your primary experience of Bronte. And then when you're reading Bronte, you as a reader are treating Bronte almost as an adaptation of this, even though you know intellectually that's not the case. If you enjoyed Jumanji and are looking for more adaptations of Jumanji, check out Zathura, a 2005 movie, the Jumanji TV series from 1996, or the 2007 pachinko game made by Fuji Shoji. You can rate and review this show anywhere fine podcasts are available. For those viewing in YouTube land, if you haven't already, please like this video, subscribe to the Talking Studios channel for all our exciting content, and follow us on social media at Talking Studios. Check out other shows by Talking Studios, including Talking Pictures Trivia, where we explore movies through trivia, Keep Making Movies, where we explore micro-budget films, Limited Lexicon, where we play through text-based adventure games, and Get the Point, where we slowly reveal a movie poster and try to guess which movie poster it is. Got a question for us? Call the Talking Studios hotline at 201-467-8679 and leave a message. It may be featured on a future episode. And if you haven't already, please subscribe to Adapt It, wherever fine podcasts are found. Join us next time when we discuss the Beatles' discography and look at the 2007 film Across the Universe.
Wow, Talking Studios.
Next week, we'll be discussing the Beatles' discography. Pat, if you could adapt the Beatles' discography into any medium, what would it be?
See, I would make a television series, and it would follow the follies and adventures of lovely Rita Metermaid. And it would just be all about Rita the Meter Maid, and it would be all the different people that lovely Rita Meter Maid would meet.
Mhm.
That is it.
I love it. Right? People don't like, or in Philly, people do not like the PPA. Like they made a whole TV show about following them around actually, and like seeing the mean things that people say to them as they're. So I'm imagining the show as she starts, and everyone's angry that she's giving them a ticket, but she wins them over every episode with kindness.
Well, that's
and...
that's one of my favorite. I love that Beatles song, and I think it's just so fun for that exact reason. I just think it's really funny that they love the Meter Maid, and just the way they describe her, I think is really funny. Like I really like lovely Rita Meter Maid. KJ, what about you? What would you adapt the Beatles discography into?
All right, bear with me a little bit. Have you guys ever went to Disney World and then specifically what was MGM Studios is now Hollywood Studios? They had I don't know if it was called the Monster Sound Show. So you go in, you're sitting in the theater, and they showed you a short with Chevy Chase and Martin Short. And then they'd have people come up on stage, and they would do the Foley sounds. So they would step on the sand, step on the gravel, shake the sheet to make the thunder, and they tried to line it up with the movie. And then they'd play back the movie with the new sound effects, and it was a really fun thing. After that, you'd go into another little area that had coconuts that you could like clomp to go with the animation of a horse or whatever. But they had these little sound booths, and you could put headphones on, and it wasn't 3D sound, but if you closed your eyes, you really felt like you were wherever you were listening to. And it was a whole thing where I forget if Mickey was there and you were like getting a haircut, but before they could give you a haircut, they would use like a hair dryer on your face, and the sound of the hair dryer, you swore you felt the air. So I would love that experience, that immersive sound experience based on something silly with the Beatles, like either tuning up their guitars, getting ready for a show, something like this, and then a little bit of the music too. I think it'd be really fun to have an audio VR experience with the Beatles.
I'm sure Apple's new headset for $3,000 will help you with that.
Could
It'll
probably
help
do
you
it.
with that.
Yeah. It'll be an Apple cross promotional.
How about you, Tom? What would you adapt the Beatles discography into?
I think it'd be fun to have for little kids who are learning to go to the bathroom, pull up diapers, and each diaper
Those
is a
exist,
theme.
Tom.
Yeah, no, yes, I know. But each one is a theme of a different single, like a different Beatles single. So you'd be like, which one did I get today? Ooh, look at this. It's, yeah, whatever.
I'm
Hey
being an
Jude, or
Eleanor Rigby.
I'm being an Eleanor Rigby. Oh, it's, yeah.
The
That
Yellow
sounds,
Submarine writes itself. We're all good.
indeed, yes. There we go. That's what it could be called, the Yellow Submarine. I think that would be a good product name.
And when you poop, it's the Rocky Raccoon.
Huh.
Top shelf.
I-
Top shelf.
um,
My kids
Audience.
only know one Beatles song, and it is Rocky Raccoon. I taught them
Oh.
Rocky Raccoon, which is quite fun to have them singing Rocky Raccoon.
That's a fun song.
Anyway, audience, next week we're discussing Across the Universe, which is on HBO right now, Hard Day's Night, which is on HBO right now, and possibly Yesterday, which is on Hulu right now.